So hi and welcome. It's great to see you today and thank you for taking the time to speak to me. So my name's Caitlin and I'm a student on placement currently with Dundee Volunteer and Voluntary Action. DVVA are a large organisation that helps with third sector organisations to help them more resilient and sustainable. They do this by a number of different ways, and one of them is by providing support with good governance at trustees level. So could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your trustee role, please?
Yeah, so my name is Joshua Connor. I'm the former president now of Dundee University Students Association. I was president there for the last academic year, 2019-20, and that encompassed me being a trustee of the organisation, as in the Students Association, but also being a trustee of the University of Dundee at the same time. These are roles that I now no longer have due to being at the end of my term, but nonetheless seeking other trustee experiences now as a result.
That's great. So how did you get into that role, being a student?
Well, it's very interesting story actually. So during that year, there were several elections for the sabbatical positions, different sabbatical positions within the organisation. And I actually came in through a by-election rather than the main elections. So a president was elected back in March and then decided that it wasn't for them and went off to get another opportunity. So the by-election came. And at that point, I thought, well, why not? I was an active student representative on the student council anyway, so I had some degree of an understanding of what the Students Association would do and how that would work. So yeah, I think went for the election, got elected, and then started that transition process between the old executive and the new executive. So fun times, possibly quite a little bit stressful, particularly when you're trying to manage your degree and indeed that sort of public facing role. But it's slightly different, obviously, to how other trustees may be co-opted onto different charities. And that's sort of what is unique about student unions in that sense, that the trustees are majoritarily elected and the student trustees have the majority on the board with some externals who are co-opted on.
Yeah. So how did you manage to juggle your studies and these commitments?
So basically, it's hard to explain really in one sense, because you sort of have three dimensions when I was president. Certainly I felt I had three dimensions. I had one where I was a student leader, which was sort of 9 to 5 job. There was then the governance aspect of it, which again seeped into the 9 to 5, but mainly were after hours. And then you had the university governance side of things as well. So I think the first thing to say is that we all took a gap year, and that was supported by the university, because I don't think you could manage a degree and indeed do that sort of a job. But nonetheless, they did put us through a course to help us identify our own professional development goals and how we move forward with that. Into our future careers. But was also very conscious that you only really have 1 year to make, or less than 1 year to really make a change. So it does go by quite quickly to make that change. But it is about that making sure that what you're doing is in the best interests of the organisation, but also what's in the best interests of the people that the charity serves, i.e. the students.
Yeah. So you mentioned the training, like what does the role actually involve for you?
So the role, if I take the DUSA aspect of that first, now I'll go into the university aspect later. For DUSA, it was mainly about ensuring that we were being run properly, that the senior management team were operating within the overall strategy that the board agreed. And sometimes that was quite interesting, because I was coming into the organisation midway through that strategy. So there'd been some work that had already been completed, but yeah, I could see that there was a need to possibly change our strategy, given how often the student demographic changes and the needs of the students change. So there was that conversation, discussion about how we ensure that the charity is agile enough to change where it is going in order to suit the needs of those that we serve. It also looked at things like risk management, finance, HR issues, and how are our processes effective. And I think that's the one thing that I think possibly puts people off from being a trustee, is knowing that they have that legal responsibility to ensure that, you know, a charity is being well run. But what I do feel is that there are organisations like DVVA and other, you know, sources of support there that actually minimise that a little bit in keeping you on the straight and narrow. And if you've got a good staff team, you have to be able to trust in them that they're running the organisation, you know, effectively. So that was always a comfort for me, knowing that was always taking place, and you could see that through the paperwork. But I can appreciate that sort of younger people might be put off by that, and initially maybe feel that they're not welcome within that sphere. But I would absolutely argue that young people are imperative in that decision making, because I certainly feel that, you know, there is a perception that trustee boards are all, you know, pale, male and stale, and in some ways that is true, and having that young person's perspective can inject a bit of vitality into any sort of organisation. So I would encourage people to do that. And in terms of the university side, that was slightly different, because I was there because I was elected as a student leader. But when I was in the university court, which was the governing body of the university, I wasn't there to be that role. I was there to do what was in the best interests of the university. Now, initially, I had more trepidation about joining the court than I did DUSA's Board of Trustees, mainly because there was my role tended to focus a lot more on corporate governance, which was, you know, how, you know, not looking at the operational, although that is where I was operating on a day-to-day level, but had to look above that and, you know, is the university finances okay? You know, are we going to meet, you know, for example, the outcome agreements that the university agrees with the Scottish Funding Council every year? So that was quite a transition, and I was certainly not put off, but I certainly was aware that my financial acumen perhaps wasn't as great as some other people that were serving on the court. But I think naturally my approach was always to try and be constructive, recognise where I felt work was being done correctly, but also constructively challenge. And you do bring a little bit of that student representation and, you know, advocacy into that, but you do try to make decisions in, you know, for what's in the best interests of the university as well. So it was sort of a dual role in that sense, and you have to ameliorate that sometimes, and that wasn't always easy. But again, I think other trustee roles are slightly more simple in that respect.
So you mentioned about your age. How did you feel going into that role at such a young age and having such a big responsibility?
Well, I didn't really consider my age. Actually, a lot of previously to that, like I said, I was on student council. I'd also worked quite heavily with a charity in England, Young Minds, a massive mental health national charity, advising them, etc. So there wasn't things that were too dissimilar in terms of what I knew about charity governance, albeit the slight distinctions between the Scottish paradigm and the English paradigm. But I certainly felt a degree of trepidation in some aspects of the job, because I was aware that I was quite young within my university career, and would that be somewhat disadvantage, you know, the older you know, students that I was serving with. But that soon dissipated, I would say. And yeah, I think it is about recognizing that just because someone is of a certain age or is younger than someone who perhaps has 20 years experience doesn't necessarily mean that experience is always correct, and doesn't necessarily mean it's as applicable, which I must admit, I think there was a few occasions where I felt I needed to mention that, because I fully understood and appreciated people's experience, but it wasn't necessarily applicable to what we were discussing. And there was a need for that change in where we were heading as an organisation, particularly with the changing nature of the student demographic and what their student union doesn't not just looks like now, but what it'll look like in 10 years' time. And I didn't feel coming into the role that we were having those discussions as frankly as we should have been.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
COVID-19, I think, certainly fast-tracked that conversation, because we are now in a very, very different organisation to what, well, the DUSA is a very, very different organisation now as a result of COVID-19 than what it was at the start of the year, and has accelerated some change that has been coming down the line, but I think would have possibly have liked to have had a bit more time to prepare for that. But nonetheless, it's been good in some ways, but also negative in others.
Could you tell me about some of the changes with the coronavirus? Like, obviously, it's a huge impact on a charity at that time.
Well, again, I think one of the more unique areas about a student union is their trading capacity, and the services that a student union provides to students. So, for example, DUSA was quite heavily involved in nighttime economy for students, and that's correct in providing that experience. Most university students who come to university want that, but nonetheless, you have to be agile enough to be aware that shift is slowly coming, where there are going to be more students who don't want to necessarily go out and party. We have a shop that we trade quite regularly. That was one of probably our biggest earners, food and beverage, etc. So that the impact on that cumulatively, I think, was absolutely devastating, for the organisation, because and it still is. I mean, we can't run our, they can't run their club nights as usual. The main source of their income has gone. Luckily, we've got DUSA has a good relationship with the university, and they provide a reasonable subvention to do what the student union is supposed to do, which is to represent the interests. But and whilst that is important, there are other aspects to a students' union. So it's been absolutely devastating, and I think DUSA in itself has got some very, very interesting conversations to have, albeit I'm no longer part of them. But they've certainly that certainly was coming down the line, and like I said, there are changes that will come out of this. Some positive. I think the idea of blended learning, for example, blended work, I think will be positive. I think looking at how students get together will be interesting going forward. But also how we communicate, I think, with students is going to be increasingly important, particularly as, guidance is always changing. So some positives, but I think in terms of the organisation being safeguarded for the future, I think there possibly have been, and I assume there's been some quite tough conversations that have had to take place as to what the priorities of limited resources are now.
Yeah.
And that's the same for everywhere, I would expect.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So after your role, obviously, because you've left DUSA now, what are you thinking about moving forward in a future trustee role?
So I'm no longer in Dundee. I decided I wanted a bit of a fresh start. I've been in Dundee for 3 years, had 3 fabulous years in Dundee, and do miss Scotland, but felt I needed a new challenge and some new horizons. So I am currently looking for some trustee experience, because I did quite like that experience. It does provide great transferable skills. Having something like that on your CV at a young age is absolutely incredible. It also gives you a perspective of how an organisation is run, which again is invaluable for future work. So as I say, if young people want to get involved, they should really be encouraged to do so, because it isn't just about where they're going to take an organisation, but it's also about where it's going to take them. I know a lot of student leaders, student officers, for example, do go on to get quite high-flying roles within the charity sector, or indeed within student unions, because they understand that sector more intimately than perhaps someone from the outside of that. So yeah, great transferable skills. Obviously, I'm currently looking. Nothing been yielded just yet, but I am cognizant that I have moved very recently, so it's not going to be overnight. But also felt that I wanted a few months off, given that the last year had been quite challenging, and that time to debunk, as it were, has been very much useful.
Great. If one last thing that I'd like to ask is, if a young person was looking or thinking about becoming a trustee, what would you say to them?
Keep an open mind. Don't be afraid of challenging. Challenge is always good so long as it is done constructively, and always, I think, speak your truth, because ultimately charities are social, are great vehicles of social change, and that has to, in my view, has to be led by people who have particular interests in that area, or indeed have direct applicable experience to a particular area. So definitely speak your truth, definitely bring your experiences, because that informs what that charity does from the top down. And you do have that influence. You're not necessarily there as a manager, but you are there to set the overall direction. So if you've got particular interest in what a charity is doing and feel you've got that expertise on the ground about how that works, informing a charity's strategy in that sense could be really, really rewarding, and indeed benefit not just yourself but also the wider community that the charity serves. So don't just sit there and be quiet. You're there to use your voice, and please do find it, because it is important.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time and coming here to answer some questions.
Not a problem. Thank you very much.